So we've heard a lot about the opportunities and some of the new technologies, and now we're going to hear a bit about the roadblocks that we still have to overcome. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nick Manley. Nick is Senior Economics and Policy Researcher at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment.
Hello, and thanks a lot for sticking around just before lunch. Adrian wants me to be the booman of the conference by telling you about what is not working. But first is to thank Adrian for the opportunity to launch our report here. It's called the Renewable Power of the Mind, and it doesn't only have the roadblocks, it also has some other sections that are forward-looking. I'll be presenting only part of it. You'll see a couple of flyers outside that are going around. There is a QR code and also the website in case you want to download it and look at it. And thanks also for giving us a deadline, you know. I've been looking at this for a year, and having a deadline is very good. I'm so glad that I don't have to look at this report anymore. I hope now other people will do that. So just to give you a little bit background of the report before jumping into the roadblocks, this project, or maybe I should start with who we are, because I think we stick out a little bit from the other actors in this room. I work at Columbia University. It's a research center that focuses on trying to maximize the benefits of foreign direct investment and try and mitigate the negative externalities. So I particularly work on extractive industries, and mining being a key part of that. And we did a bit of work around the power of the mind, which is a report that our colleague from the World Bank will be speaking to later on, about leveraging investments in infrastructure, and particularly in energy infrastructure, to help reduce costs for mining companies and help with electrification. And this is essentially the follow-up, looking particularly at renewables, because when we did that study at the time, there were not many case studies yet that looked at solar and wind, and we thought it would be worthwhile to do a follow-up on this topic. So the report goes through the power arrangements, how different companies are approaching it, and the opportunities. It has a section on the roadblocks that I will be speaking to you more about. It looks at the trends and drivers. And what we did essentially over the last year and a bit, we looked at all the literature. We tried to capture a lot of the case studies that have been presented here to see what are the lessons learned from that. We interviewed with more than 50 people that work in the space. A lot of them are sitting in here, but also people that are not sitting in here. And I think one of the value adds of the report is to try and reach those, because I think I'm preaching here to the choir. But ultimately, the world of mining companies and the world of IPPs is a lot larger than the guys that are sitting here, right? So that's also the target audience, and our recommendations in the report are addressed at the various stakeholders that will have to work together to implement some of this. So let me jump into the roadblocks, and a lot of the things were mentioned here. So I'm going to just expand on the ones that I feel haven't already been flagged, or expand on those. So the first ones that we looked at are technical. Intermittency and variability is an issue that you're all familiar with, not only on a daily basis, but you also have to look at yearly basis, and then multi-year cycles. So what happens in El Niño years? You have to take that into consideration, right? But I'm not going to expand on those, because we had lots of presentations around that, and ways that people are trying to address it. And storage is obviously a game changer in that, right? Location and installation, also a lot was talked about this. So the sun doesn't shine everywhere, the wind doesn't blow everywhere. Funnily enough, if you superimpose all the maps of radiation, wind, geothermal, hydropower, you pretty much cover all the regions in the world, and in many cases a combination of different renewable sources are there. Site-specific issues were also highlighted. So not only is there sun, or is there, and particularly with wind, is there wind in the region, but how are the wind conditions specifically on near the mine site or on the mine site? And the one thing that I would like to focus a little bit more on the technical side is the land use intensity. So diesel-fired generators are probably the power source that requires least amount of land use. If you look at solar PV, it's 37 times the amount of land required as compared to diesel generators. Wind is only 2.5%. Yesterday, one of the things that I found particularly interesting, and the conversation also propped up today a couple of times, of biofuels. Biofuels, the land intensity is 1,250 times fossil fuels. This is an issue because I think, if you think large scale about what will be the role of biofuels in this energy transition, you will have to plant a lot of land in order to tackle it with biofuels. And in many regions you may say, okay, well, there is plenty of land available, but oftentimes, communities use the land even if it's not industrially used. So land conflicts and land issues around that are really significant. This is, by the way, also an area where I think renewable power installations and companies, IPPs, can learn from the mining sector, right? The social license to operate. You're not only having social conflicts in mining, you're having a lot of social conflicts propping up in the renewable sector. So that's where maybe reverse learning can happen, because the mining sector has a lot of experience on that. On the expertise, as I said, I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys are the experts, but a lot of the people that we spoke to, they don't have necessarily a person in the mining company that focuses on energy and knows the latest developments in renewables. Some of the interviews, they're like, oh yeah, we looked at that 5 years ago. And you're like, well, things have changed since then. Like, the change is so rapid, but people are not necessarily aware of that. Same on the procurement side. The way that you procure is not necessarily the same that you use to procure diesel. The contracts, the way that you procure changes. You need to adapt your procurement systems. Logistics, and a lot was talked about, the benefits of not having a road, the benefits of some of these logistics to get fuel trucks to the mine site. I looked at the Diavik mine site and looked at their fuel consumption and the displacement of the wind farm there. And if you look at power, it's 11% of power displacement. But if you include the diesel that powers the mine trucks, it becomes fairly insignificant. So we're talking about 489 trucks that they need to bring up there, as compared to 37 trucks that won't have to drive up there. Instead, you have, and I think yesterday it was mentioned, you have to integrate maybe a new player on the mine site that needs to work together with, if you have another company running the diesel gen sets, you need to coordinate that. Who's responsible if you have a problem on the power generation side? So the logistics are still complex. I think a lot of IPPs, by providing hybrid solutions, are trying to address that. But this was definitely a key component during the interviews that jumped out as something that still needs to be worked on. And electrifying surrounding communities. I was really glad to hear this morning that this is becoming increasingly a topic and is on the radar. And a lot of interviews that we did, it was like, let's not talk about the communities for now. Let's try to just integrate renewables at the mine site, because that's difficult enough. If we take into account the community and trying to electrify them, it's just going to add another actor. It's going to make things more complex. Leave that for another stage. And I find that quite I mean, I find it surprising because recently I recently moved to Norway, and I met with Norsk Hydro, and they were showing me some pictures of back in the days of where they used to mine, and they used to build everything right next to the mine site. They used to build the schools, the electricity generation system, the hospitals. So it's not like something new that mining companies go to new areas and provide all these services. So sometimes I think, between them and now, I've often felt some sort of resistance to that approach, because this is the responsibility maybe of governments, and I'm not arguing that it's not. But the mining companies back in the days, played that role before. It's not something new. Wiper is another example. I mean, and it was mentioned yesterday, the community or the township around that was also built up by Rio Tinto. The third roadblock around financing, and this is probably one of the bigger ones, a lot was discussed about, the mining companies have an aversion to upfront capital costs, so they rather outsource it to an IPP. When it comes to the IPP, sometimes financing becomes an issue. It becomes more expensive. One guy that we interviewed with for a particular case, he said, the interest rate for the project jumped from 4% that they could get as a mining company to 7%. And then, obviously, in order to get that down, you need a PPA agreement, a purchasing power agreement, where then the length of the PPA becomes the main issue, right? And that was also discussed yesterday, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the graph kind of shows just a simulation of the power price. So the longer the PPA, the more advantageous the renewable power project becomes. Particularly for gold mines, the life of mine will depend on the reserves, right? And the reserves for gold mines tend to be, or the life of mine of gold mines tend to be shorter. So there, it's a particular issue of the length of the PPA. And then even when you have a life of mine of 20 years, the mining company may not necessarily be too eager to commit to a 20-year PPA. One example is because it takes their flexibility, right? It takes their flexibility of putting a mine on care and maintenance when the commodity prices crash, and it takes the flexibility of benefiting from lower electricity prices. So Chile is a good example. After the power crisis there, mining companies signed 15 to 20-year PPAs and are now paying $100 or more dollars per megawatt hour, when prices have come down significantly to about $38 per megawatt hours, but they're locked in to still the old price. You guys are all telling us how the price is going to drop even further. So from a mining perspective, if you commit, when should you commit, and how long do you want to commit? So there, the length of the PPAs, even for projects that have longer term reserves and longer mine of life, the commitment has fallen. On the regulatory side, obviously fossil fuel subsidies are still a big roadblock. This graphic compares the subsidies of fossil fuel against renewables. Fossil fuel subsidies are still higher than renewables. This is also linked to the price of petroleum. That's why you see the big drop. So it's not because that many countries got completely rid of subsidies. You actually, if you extend the timeline, and I didn't have it for 2017 for renewables, but the fossil fuel subsidies are creeping back up as oil prices rise again. Tax credits, tax fuel exemptions. So in many countries, like for example, South Africa or Australia, the sector that gets most tax credits is the mining sector. Lack of renewable specific regulations. So a lot of the projects that we're talking about in Canada, Australia, or Chile, there you have a regulatory system, but in many of the other countries you don't. in the case where you're off-grid and you have a PPA agreement that doesn't go through the grid, you can address that through a contract. But as soon as you want to use the grid, you need a regulatory system in place, and in many countries that's still missing. And then there is also a lack of incentives for first movers and for electrifying surrounding communities. And then the fifth one, which I think is probably the biggest, is the interests and incentives. And these are just some of the recent events of what's on the government side, what's driving decisions. Trump won you could argue that Trump won his campaign on his Trump digs coal advocacy, and he won important states with that. The Yellow Vest movement in France that is currently undergoing is started because of fuel price rises, taxes on fuel. PAPI, which must be the best acronym in the world ever, but stands for petrol and paraffin People Against Petrol and Paraffin Increases. There's a group in South Africa that will mobilize as soon as the government threatens to remove or increase fuel prices. So there is a lot of pushback. So from the government perspective, those that want to appeal to certain electoral circles, it's difficult. The public utility, as soon as you impose energy reforms that take away the monopoly power of the utilities, they're going to oppose that. I think our colleagues from South Africa can tell us a story or two about that. And then the beneficiaries from the incumbent system, and this was also mentioned, I think, yesterday. So the import and distribution of diesel and of fuels in a lot of developing countries is controlled by the business elite, which often is very closely tied with the political elite. So building a renewable power plant is not in their best interest. But I also think that in the private sector, there are conflicting interests and incentives. And let me tell you a quote that's also in the report, which this is my first conference that I've come to, so I don't know if this is true, but this is from a guy that we interviewed that came to this conference for many, many years, and 2 years ago decided, with mining, like this is not working. And this is what he said to me. Maybe the most important question to ask is who has been driving this debate? It has been the developers trying to sell their products to mining companies rather than the other way around. For the past 5 years, I've been to conferences around the world where people speak about falling costs of renewables and that we are at the cusp of an inflection point where renewables and mining will become mainstream. But the reality is that we are still talking about the same case studies we talked about 5 years ago, which suggests that there is no mainstreaming of this. As long as it is the IPPs pushing this agenda and not driven by mining companies demanding renewables, I don't see an inflection point. Now, a lot of you have been to these conferences, and I've spoken to some people here, and they say, well, it seems to really be changing now. I don't know, but maybe it's a good opportunity for you to reflect, trying to think through what has, how the excitement or the non-excitement has evolved over these meetings. If you look at the statistics and the percentage that renewables make up in electricity generation of mining, it hasn't changed since the 1970s. It's relatively flat, below 10%. But I'm not saying, there are a lot of great projects here, so don't get me wrong. I also want to speak a little bit about innovation and the first mover problem. I think a lot of people are saying we need to invest more in technology, we need to invest in and push the envelope a little bit. Just to put it in comparison, innovation as a percentage of revenues in the mining sector is around 0.5%. In manufacturing, it's 2 to 3%, and in oil and gas, it's 3 to 5%. Okay, so I'll conclude by showing you the positive side of the report. And sorry to be a party pooper, but you told me to be. There are a lot of positive things to take away, I think. I'm very encouraged by the conversations here, by what I've heard. I think one aspect or one advantage that I quickly want to touch upon is, the social license to operate. Because I really think that this is going to be key for the sector, particularly with automation. We're currently doing a study on trying to understand the social impacts resulting from automation in the mining sector. You see automation being implemented in places like Australia and Canada. Try doing that in South Africa, or in places where the social needs and the dependence and the pushback from labor unions is going to be a lot harder. I think that's a space to look out for. And I really welcome your feedback. I think we're very eager from a research perspective to help roll out the understanding of this to actors that may not be in this room. If there is any follow-up research that you think is useful to forward the agenda, then please do let me know, and I hope we can have a constructive conversation, which I promise is going to be more positive than this presentation. Thank you very much.